Well, here we are, back again for April. Warm welcome to you all. Future Work Scotland. This is our April event. If it's your first time with us, very warm welcome to you. A few familiar faces. Welcome back to all of you who've been here with us before. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sath. I'm an organiser of Future Work Scotland and your lead host for this session. I'm delighted and pleased to see Paula back. So Paula's joining us this evening to support me and do all the really hard, important bits that you don't see that go on behind the scenes. Standing in for Donald because Donald can't be here this evening, and I can't remember the last time Donald missed one of these. So it's quite interesting for me to be doing this here today. Just the usual formalities, code of conduct. We keep it very simple here. We just ask you all to be respectful to one another. Want everyone to have a great experience. That's as complicated as it gets. Although we are about to talk about what I would regard as quite a complex topic. Sheila and I were just chatting just before we came on air. And of course, if you have questions as we go along, please feel free to drop them in the chat, prefix them with a Q so it's easier for Paula and I to spot them. But we are going to be quite interactive in this session. Sheila's going to set the scene in a second, contextualize a little bit, introduce us to things. You'll have an opportunity to participate, which is always good because we want to hear what you think, what your thoughts are, and then Sheila and I are going to have a bit of a chat around certain things. Going to be talking a little bit about this in a second. Hope you can see it through my blurred Zoom, so we'll get onto that. And of course, we'll have a Q&A segment at the end, as we always do, and then I'll wrap us up and do any kind of updates and shout outs, etc. And if you have anything you want to share this evening with the group, you're more than welcome to do so at the end. So that's it. So I'm delighted to welcome Sheila Walsh to Future World Scotland. In fact, welcome back. So Sheila's actually been here before, quite some years ago, but we couldn't remember exactly when. But we'll hold that thought because we are going to come back to that because it will be relevant later in the session. So you'll just have to wait for that. Sheila's somebody's work who we really admire, I have to say, at Future Work Scotland. She's been doing incredible work in this inclusivity space. She's the founder of, is it Ellis Advantage? I think she's called. So doing a whole bunch of things there, lecturing, coaching, really helping organizations to embrace inclusive workplaces. I'd say really multidiscipline, multi-talented is certainly how I always view Sheila, and she is a leadership development specialist really at the heart of all of that. And she's got incredible credentials in this space. So yeah, we love following Sheila's work, and we're delighted that she's joined us again for this session this evening. So without further ado, over to you, Sheila, and welcome back.
Thank you so much, Seth. I appreciate multi, I can't remember the word you were saying, dimensional and or practice. And then you said talented, so I'll take it. It's always a good feeling when you're called
Multi-talented.
talented. Right, multi-talented. It's really good to be here, so thank you. We are going to talk a little bit about inclusive leadership, and it's getting more and more contentious in so many ways across the globe. More recently this week in Scotland with different high court cases. So I think there's a piece around just before we go in, we do want to have a good, what I would consider rich conversation, which means we probably won't agree on everything. And I just think that's a good way to start these conversations because it's not inclusive if we only include what we agree with. So as much as being respectful is powerful and important, it's also going to be important that we can sit with the idea that people come to different ideas themselves about their world and their ideas of inclusion based on their experiences, just like you and I have. So I'll use a couple of slides, but just so that I don't forget. But on top of that, just to say, Patrick, I really love your screen. I was looking at it and I was thinking, oh, that's very close. Collaborate, deliver, reflect, and improve. I think those words are really important words for the likes of tonight. So I saw that and I was like, oh, that's fabulous. So let's just use the slides to give you a little bit of a bit of shape so that I don't just blab on, because this is my favorite topic, if I'm honest with everyone. The first thing to say, so my business is called Ellis Advantage, but there's kind of a bit of a joke in that. Ellis is my name spelled backwards. because someone told me you can't name your business after yourself because when you go to sell it, nobody will buy it. And the funny part is I'm dyslexic, so I did it backwards because I thought it was kind of a bit more funny. To me, it gives me a little joy. But also ELLIS is an acronym for Effective Leadership, Inclusive Solutions. And so that's kind of at the center of everything I do. I don't always talk about inclusion, but inclusion is how I do all the stuff around effective leadership. We think about it, we work with it, we engage people. So it's kind of just a baseline, I think. I will try and keep an eye on the chat, but if I miss it, we will come back. Yeah, I thought I'd seen it before. Thank you for naming that. Okay, so we're going to talk. I wrote a book May last year in 2024, and it was really funny because I wrote it because I'm in the middle of a PhD on inclusive leadership, and there was a load of data I wasn't allowed to write into the PhD for a couple of reasons. So I said, right, well, that's it now. I'll have to just put it into a book. So I don't know anyone else who does this, but I paused the PhD and I went to write the book. And when I say I paused the PhD, I just took 3 months off, and I finished up the book, and it has led me to all sorts of interesting conversations, and I'm hoping that's what we get out of it tonight. Some interesting conversations. So maybe to start is kind of a really important starting question, and I'd love to see your answers in the chat. But what comes to mind for you when you think of the term inclusive leadership? What are the kind of things that that means to you? It'd be really nice to see that before I go any further so that I can first of all get a sense of what these things mean to you, but also so that I can think about that in how we have this discussion. So I'll give you a chance to add it to the chat, and I'll read it out for anyone watching the replay. So that would be helpful. Just what comes to mind for you? And there's no wrong answer. I don't ask people to write things. If there's a wrong answer, I don't set people up like that. Diverse perspective, okay. Bringing out the best in everyone, okay. What other things come up for people? Taking into account the opinions of others. Yeah. Easier said than done, I'd argue, sometimes. What other kind of things come to mind for people? And you might want to put more than one as well. You might have some thoughts. Let's give you a moment. For me, inclusive leadership is being mindful of who is and is not in the room. I really like that term. Drawing forth what is trying to emerge. Yeah, so it's not just about who, it's about what. I talk about that quite a bit. Better solutions. I really love that, Sheila. Equality, taking into account the opinions of others. I've read that. Okay, so we're already getting different. While these interpretations are quite aligned, there's also differences in the focus, you know. Sheila's focus, for instance, is on solutions, so that's outcome. Erin's, and if I mispronounce anyone's name, my apologies, but Erin's focus is on being mindful about who is and isn't in the room and what's trying to come forward. Timmy is talking about equality. Casa is taking into account the opinions of others. Patrick is talking about bringing out the best in everyone. And Katie said diverse perspective. So while they might be aligned, people are looking at it from different points. And I think the number one thing I found in the research and in working with organizations is it means very different things to different people. And pretending that it means one thing is probably the start of the problems that we're having. Joe has put in awareness of ways of looking and valuing differences for the sake of richer, more diverse sense making. Yeah. So again, like really beautiful definition. Everything everyone has said, I'd say an incubator for innovation. Definitely. We know it's one of the number one things that the research is telling us. So while we all have kind of close enough sharing, there are parts we're focusing on differently. And that's how we've come to the topic. That's our relationship with it. That's our history. That might be the public narrative that we've taken on or the corporate narrative. But it is important to know that actually nobody said the exact same thing. And when I started my research, I got really annoyed because I thought I was going to get to do a really sexy piece of research. And it turned out that we couldn't even agree on the term. And so I couldn't get into all the fun research I wanted to do because I actually first had to define the term. So it was quite a frustrating moment when with all the commercial work being done in the area, all the money being spent, all the efforts, and there's not an agreement on what we're talking about. So there were some mild agreements. So I kind of came with this definition based on, just like I asked you, asking hundreds of people what they think it is, looking at the research and maybe looking at the things that separate it from other types of leadership. And so the definition that I use, and this isn't to say it's correct, it's just to say that this is what I mean when I'm talking this evening, is it's the effective use of inclusion practices. And I say that because if you're an inclusive leader and you're running around focused on inclusion, but you're not leading, I don't think that's inclusive leadership because you're not going to be there for long because you're not producing some kind of result. So for me, there has to be the effective use of inclusion practices. The next part is formal and informal. So in my research, one of the really interesting things was everybody, when you talk about leadership, talks about formal title. They often like automatically think about like a management title, a leadership title. But what I have found is that people from marginalized groups tend to do something called social leadership and thought leadership very naturally, meaning that they influence and lead often beside or behind and not always in formal positions. And the reason for that is it's part of, unfortunately, the additional barriers that marginalized communities have to face. But one of the strengths of it is that often they're leading without a title. And so I thought it would be really unfair to only think about leadership as a formal title, because we'd be replicating some of the kind of dominant norms that are already existing. So by acknowledging informal, we acknowledge that people are leading without titles every day and doing amazing things without the title. And then it's also just to position it within an organization. And there's kind of three things: creating an inclusive, psychologically safe, and high performing organization. So the research is telling us that where there's inclusion, there's psychological safety. Where there's effective inclusion, I should say, the psychological safety. Where there's psychological safety, we get and inclusion, we get higher performance. And so you will see that I have no word of diversity in this, and I'm going to comment on why that is. Um, you can have an inclusive group that is not diverse. They're just not going to be the strongest group when you use inclusion. You get better outcomes from diverse groups when you use inclusion than you do from um, homogenous groups using inclusion. So really for the optimal result of inclusive leadership, you actually need a really diverse group. And then you need inclusive practices that are effective, but not just from the people with the formal title, but also informal. So for me, this definition is a little bit of rewriting the underlying philosophy about leadership, which is leadership is only valuable if you have a title, which is kind of based on some white supremacy issues, but also it it reframes inclusive leadership as something people can do with or without a title, because I know they're doing it with or without a title. So I'm just naming the thing that happens every day in lots of settings. And so I just think that's kind of an important one. I'm just going to check the chat to see if there's anything I can respond to or add.
There was a couple of things from
Yeah.
there, and I thought if you want to
What
pick them
is
up now, that's cool because I thought
yeah.
we did in the Q&A. But yeah, if you want to do it now, that's awesome.
Yeah, so what is effective inclusion? So inclusion, the best definition of inclusion that has a scientific measure that I have found to date is Shore et al.'s 2011, which is the effective facilitation of uniqueness and belonging. So it's where somebody's uniqueness is valued. So that's whatever differences they bring, not just identity.
Hmm.
And also they feel that they belong in the setting. When those two things happen, and you're using that in your leadership, you can create outcomes. One of the things I found in the research was that some people ticked all the boxes for what people might think an inclusive leader was, but they might not have been getting things done. So in work settings, it was becoming problematic where people were perceived to be very inclusive, but not effective leaders. And so that's why I'm saying the effective use. Inclusion, from my definition, needs to support the purpose of leadership. It's not just being inclusive for the sake of it in workplaces. I have to be really clear. It's very different to society. What I will say is society has a different standard for inclusion, because once you exist in the society, you have a right to be included. But in workplaces, we're only included because we have value to add. So for instance, I can't just go to the Law Society of Scotland and say, I want to be a lawyer. I have to hit standards to be included for that. And that's what I mean by effective. So just to say inclusion practices, my
Mm.
research has actually identified, and then I'll come back to the other ones. Oh yeah, Seth has said I'll pick that one up, but I think that definition of inclusion is helpful, just to be clear. So I want to talk about some of the stuff that people have told me privately, but never admit to publicly, right? When I say, what do you think of inclusion? When I get people to publicly share, they share things like what you shared. When I get people to do it anonymously or in a very safe space, what ends up happening is that they end up telling me other things, either directly or indirectly. So these are the kind of things people don't always say out loud, the unspeakable bits, but very much come into their thinking, whether it's conscious or unconscious, right? So some people think it's only about identity. Um, Meaning that when they think about inclusion, they think about a very particular identity being included. They don't think about a broader sense of inclusion. Um, Most people think, what about me, on some level? Some people think about it in terms of disability, race, gender, sex. They're the three that I hear the most in an Irish and UK setting. Um, some focus on being right, others focus on being wronged. So if I talk about inclusion, most typically people will either position themselves to talk about how their position is right, or they'll tell me a story about how they've been wronged. We rarely talk about how we have done the wronging. So it's a really interesting kind of nuance. And indirectly, people think about lowering standards. They say things to me, don't you think the best person for the job? And if I don't get back to that, remind me to come back and kind of update that, because I have some lovely information on that. People think about quotas, unfair advantages. A lot of the time, people think about how they're being disadvantaged by inclusion efforts, unless the inclusion effort has been specifically designed for them. Um, like most of us, I'm not the issue, they are. You know, it's not me, it's you. News stories, the amount of random news stories that gets quoted to me, like, did you hear about, and they'll name one incident with one identity and want that to be the truth. Moral righteousness comes in a lot, and there's a lot of fear about getting cancelled. Then there is, these are genuine comments. By the way, I don't agree with these. I'm just telling you, these are things that have come up repeatedly in my work. People thinking that there's too much focus on minorities and ignoring the majorities. And I just want to be really clear. When they're talking about minorities, they are talking about groups that are marginalized, because what they're really talking about is actually the majority. But in their worldview, they've decided they're the minorities. So just to be clear, it's not really the minority, it's the majority they're talking about. But they usually, as white people, are perceiving themselves as the majority. When I look through the data, this kind of desire to get on with it, it doesn't matter. Let's just go on. I don't know why it's such a big topic. It wasn't in my day. It's so often being discussed. And this has nothing to do with my work. That comes up frequently. Like, why do I have to go to this training? Why do I have to go to this talk? I'm an accountant. I do, I do this, I do that. I'm a coach. I've even had, even though I'm one of the leads for the AC's global inclusion efforts, even coaches say, why should I learn that? And I'm like, but you work with people. So it's really interesting. Even when you're a people professional, it might not feel aligned. Um, a lot of people say this isn't important for my business. Just hire the best person for the job. I will come back to that later. I should do it, but I don't have the time. Diversity, they just think inclusion is the same as diversity. And then there's often a kind of sense of, oh, I have to do extra, or it's more of a hassle. So that's the kind of stuff people think but don't often say out loud, until I create an environment where I either get it anonymously or indirectly through some kind of research. So this is what often, and you've thought of some of these, so you're going to be familiar, but sometimes people don't think of these things. Okay. Sometimes people don't think about everyone. When I work with universities, they often say we want to improve diversity and inclusion, but we're worried about lowering the bar of excellence. And actually, I say, actually, the evidence tells us that you improve your excellence by creating more diversity and also inclusive practices. And they're like, really? Really surprised that that's a reality. A lot of people don't think about innovation, but ye did. Well-being, both of the people performing inclusive leadership, but also for those experiencing it. The improvement in engagement, the positive branding, the fact that it can solve everyday challenges, that inclusion doesn't have to be a separate thing you do. Inclusion can be how you solve problems, everyday problems you face in your business. It doesn't just have to be a topic on inclusion. Often people don't think about psychological safety. They don't realize the impact on teamwork. I was talking to some schools, and I was talking about the difference it would make for young people. And there is evidence that it creates more positive school cultures. It does improve performance, which very few people really think about when they talk about it. It can create what we call a collective pride. So people can feel proud of where they work and what they're part of because of it, and not for any other reason. So when we see an increase of inclusive leadership, we see people being really proud of their workplaces and talking about it differently. It can also increase differences, leading to enriched environments, but not just identity. Yes, identity and what we include can be improved. So the example I often talk about is that we can say we want diversity and we're going to be inclusive, but do you allow people to bring a different way of doing things? Do you allow them to include different points of view? And if not, then you're not getting the enrichment that it can offer. Social development, it's down there twice. That was obviously one of my dyslexic errors. So social development, it improves collaboration, emotional intelligence. So we know to practice inclusive leadership, you're going to have to improve your emotional intelligence in some way simply by doing it, because it requires you to use more emotional intelligence. It does increase the growth mindset, and also it can help people find more suitable solutions. And I suppose maybe the point I should say is I got into this originally not intending to get into inclusion work. It was always in my toolkit. It was always important to me. But what was happening was people were solving problems and annoying people. And then other people weren't buying into the solution. Sorry, I'm in the countryside, so there's some noise going behind me. So what was happening was I was getting called in to help solve leadership problems because people were making decisions, creating solutions. And then what was happening was people were resisting them. And that was simply because their solutions weren't appropriate, because they didn't know how to use inclusion to create better solutions. And they kept kind of using the same models that they knew how to use, which is basically a few people make a decision for many. Um, it does improve relationships. You increase the odds of less bullying occurring in your workplace, less interpersonal conflicts. You reduce risk. So when I work in healthcare settings, pharmaceutical settings, construction sites, places where there is high risk environments, inclusive leadership can reduce that by having conversations where people can speak up and engage with challenges better and also have routes to do it. So it's not like whistleblowing because it's normal everyday conversation that we talk about risk, and you can get better outcomes. Now, these are some of the outcomes. There are others, but the data's still emerging, let's say. We have small amounts, but we can't stand on it. But what a lot of people don't think about is this broadness. So nobody comes to me and says, Sheila, we want a really inclusive workplace because we want to beat our competitors. We want the competitive advantage. We want a positive workplace. They usually focus on we're not diverse enough or we're not inclusive enough. There's this kind of deficit starting point. And I think with this list, what's important to me is that it's based on this idea of a strengths-based approach, which is, yes, there's loads of things we should correct, and that's really important. Some of those things are actually illegal and they should be addressed really quickly and appropriately. But a lot of the time, inclusion is approached as a must rather than something that can help us fulfill our potential in our workplace. And what I have found is, although I'm deeply morally aligned with inclusion in society and workplaces, I've got more positive outcomes with organizations by focusing on the value of it in terms of, and not even the business value, but the value of harnessing the advantages of it than when I simply focus on the moral agenda. So I think that that's a really interesting one for us to think about because I deeply believe in the moral agenda, but not everyone does. And so how do I get an organization and people to buy into it? So they're just kind of two of the things that I've noticed over the last number of years, kind of collecting data on what people think when they're not being judged, and then maybe the things that they most commonly underestimate. But some of you have already seen some of these because you put it in the chat when you defined it and you made the connections. So that's just kind of some of the overview. So what I would like to know from you, because I've done a lot of talking, is what do you think are the biggest challenges you see in relation to inclusive leadership in workplaces? And then what do you want us to discuss? So if you put it in the chat, Sath and I have a few things we're going to talk about now. But it might be nice for us to see some of those questions to incorporate them or link to them. So this is your chance to say, okay, you said enough now, Sheila. I'd like you to talk about this, or Sath, I'd like your opinion on this. So this is your chance to kind of influence the conversation a bit. So I'll give you a moment to get a couple of points into the chat, and then myself and Sath will have a conversation that we have some ideas what we're talking about. But we'd also like to integrate yours. Yeah, Joe, it's the US. It's been fascinating. We can talk about it. I have to remember this on YouTube because I go to the US on Thursday, and it's been interesting. My visa took 7 days to approve. My wife's took 1 hour. I was like, oh no, this is not a good sign, right? But it'll be interesting. Okay, so I'm gonna go on. I'm a terrible timekeeper. I blame the Irish in me, but it's not. It's just I'm a terrible timekeeper. But for Sath and I to maybe have a conversation, so I'll stop screen sharing. But we can use some of your conversations. We can also come back to them, and we will come to Q&As. So I might
Absolutely.
hand it over to you, Sath.
Well, I think we're going to do something slightly different, aren't we? So normally we were doing these sorts of fireside chat type things. I'd be interviewing our guest speaker, but I think you're going to ask me some questions, aren't you? Which is going to be interesting and fun. Nothing scripted. I'm not quite sure what I might say. I've got a few thoughts and notes. But just to say, as Sheila mentioned, yeah, good context set. I think if anything, what we're seeing, and certainly what I'm taking away from what Sheila covered is this is a very broad and complex kind of landscape. There's quite a lot of, dimensions to it. can be quite nuanced. I think it'll be interesting, fascinating to really get into a little bit more. And as we said, very keen to hear from yourselves. We will have our typical Q&A at the end. But if you put interesting things into the chat you want us to maybe touch upon, as Sheila mentioned, please do so, and we'll do so. So I think I think you're about to start us off really, because I'm keen to
Yeah.
hear what you want to talk about.
Well, I think the first question was wondering, because this is what kind of kicked us off, was around the book. And I was,
Yes.
having known that you've read the book, um, what kind of thoughts or challenges or questions or what landed for you in it? Because it's really helpful
Mm.
to think about what had meaning and what didn't. And you shared quite a bit on LinkedIn. I was like, oh, that's really interesting. No one else shared that
Yeah,
quote.
yeah. So
So
no, well, I'm gonna start there because first thing I will say, so I didn't really often we would plug the books at the beginning, and we didn't do that, so apologies for not doing that. But what I will say is this for me has been a fantastic read, but also I've been dipping in and out of it for quite a while, really, in preparation for this, and just because I'm also really fascinated by the subject, I would like to better understand it. Because when you read the book, I think one of the things that becomes really apparent is just how complicated and challenging it is, and all the things that we probably don't think about. So you mentioned quotes, because we did do a few quotes. There's two things I like about it before I get into some of the things that really stood out for me was the little sort of inclusive leadership insights that you kind of share throughout. They're kind of really cool because I think some of them are quite profound, but also they're kind of anchoring. They make you stop and not just think about what you're reading, but start to think more broadly about, well, okay, what does that mean for me? What might that work and what might that mean in certain contexts? Because the whole point of all of this is you've got to think about it in your context, right? And obviously, most of us work in, the various types of workplaces, various sectors. But as you said in your intro, it's also a broader, complex societal piece, and they are quite different, right? But there are kind of linkages, and I'll share some experiences. But two bits there was two that kind of jumped out at me. So I think it's Inclusive Leadership Insight number 30. I don't know what page this is on. It said inclusive leadership requires the insight that language is always changing and never stagnant. Right. And that one really spoke to me because the whole point really that said to me, and I think this is important, and I'll come back to again later, is things are constantly evolving. And you mentioned that in your introduction, and I think we'll talk a little bit about that. The other one that jumped out at me was, I think it's number 35. It was inclusive leadership is easier when we can move through relationship ruptures. And that ruptures is that's quite strong connotations for me. You're used to like the word ruptures with more ease and get better at relational repairing. So I think they're quite strong terms. And then there's a quote. So you mentioned you got lots of really nice quotes in there. There was two. So I love quotes. I love lots of quotes. I share a lot of them on LinkedIn and in my own work and my own talks. But two that really, really got me. What the first one that I really, really liked was yes. So this one's incredible. I think this one is on page 52. So I've never heard this. So George Bernard Shaw said, the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. I think that's what we're talking about, right? Because I can think of countless scenarios where the fundamental issue has simply been that effective communication did not take place. Some people had the assumption and view that it had done, but others clearly thought it hadn't taken place in any kind of meaningful way for them. And I found myself in those scenarios, right? And it kind of lends itself nicely to what you talked about earlier when you were giving examples of what inclusive leadership is versus what it's not. And that was the other bit that jumped out at me because there's a bit later on in the book where you very explicitly give definitions of what it isn't. Things like, basically being nice and politically correct, right? Knowing everything about diverse labels, so just knowing about the protected characteristics, which you've talked about, the tick box exercise, which I've also talked about. So 2 years ago, I think it was, I got asked to do the closing keynote at Scotland Diversity Conference. And that was one of the things I was talking about, that we make assumptions and there's certain views that people take, and all of this stuff often is really based on the kind of subconscious cognitive biases that most of us have or experience or don't even think about because they're kind of programmed. So there's some of the things that did jump out to me, and the FAR model. I'm going to stop there and see what you make of all of that because I'm conscious of quite a lot. The point is, there's a lot in it, and it's really speaking to me. And I think it's a kind of book where you would find yourself coming back to it again and again because I think it offers a really powerful toolkit.
Thanks, Seth. I love when I hear what people take in because it's really interesting. The George Bernard Shaw quote is, I think, it's really important because one of
Mm,
the things when I'm working with leaders and I'll say, did you communicate that? And they'll say, yes, this is what I said, or this is what I emailed. And I said, what did they say? Oh, I didn't notice. I'm like, you don't know if they know until they say something back. That's
exactly.
kind of
Yeah.
it sounds basic, but it's not basic because we're all caught up. The other thing about repairing, I think one of the things that I've heard criticism of people that do work like me, which then sparks my interest about how I interact with it, is this idea of being right. And that a lot of people who do inclusion work or inclusive leadership work position themselves as being right. And when they make mistakes or when they, you know, like, I don't know, misunderstand something, or when somebody has a different worldview, that what can end up happening is a relationship rupture. And sometimes the person doesn't take responsibility for that and say, actually, I didn't know that word was offensive to you. It's not where I
Mm,
come from, but I really didn't understand that. I've got something to learn from that. Or,
mhm,
when we're cross at someone that we like decide to make them bad in our head instead of understanding them. And I think, and look, all my work comes back to relationships because I think that's probably the thing that fascinates me most about people is what works in relationships is not getting it right. It's actually
mm,
repairing. So, and we even like marriage research shows us this, that it's not the marriages that don't fight, it's the marriages that have the best repairing processes that tend to be most stable. And so I think there's something about us realizing that there's the content knowledge. So there are things we should know, like if something is illegal, if something falls under discrimination, if something is a microaggression and it's something I keep doing. But then there's how we do things. And I think that's where the repair part falls a little bit. Um,
yeah,
there's
agreed.
two things, there's what and there's how. And if we
Mm,
privilege just what, we get a lot of people talking about inclusion while excluding people in the conversation or while
mm,
dominating people, with the power that they have as the kind of teacher or whatever. So for me, I think it's really interesting. They're the ones that kind of that resonated with you, Seth, because they're all relational, really, I
aye.
think. Um,
Yeah, agreed. And
yeah,
I
I
think
just
that's the
someone
power
mentioned
of it. Yeah.
Gothams. I did
Yeah.
Gotham's relationship training. Yeah. So that is exactly why you'd hear Gotham's because I did his training and I use that in my work. So good catch there. Um
So just when you were talking there, though, one of the things that I think is also part of all of this is when we started to move to, so if you think about the COVID years and we did other talks on this whole subject, but the whole kind of hybrid working model and trying to do it, when we started shifting back, so we were no longer in lockdowns, but some people were, at home, some people were in offices, and you were trying to create a kind of inclusive, even at a sort of granular level, like for a meeting. And I know you cover it in bits in later parts of the book in terms of practices. I still think that's a real struggle for a lot of teams and a lot of organizations just to effectively run a meeting in an inclusive way where you've got some people physically in a room and some people, basically on the call on a call like we are. And I have seen examples where effectively those who were on the call and not physically in the room simply felt like they weren't even part of the conversation. It can be as simple as that.
I think so. I agree with you on that, and I think that that's something that there's not a lot of research on. We're still trying to make it make
Mm,
sense a little bit. There's
yes.
some research, but I don't think it's strong enough to lean on. Um, but one of the issues I have with that is the assumption that when we met in person, people were having better meetings, and
Mm,
I'm not sure that's true either.
no, I don't
I
think so.
think that the quality of meetings has always been an issue in the workplace, and that there's different reasons for that being an issue, whether it's the physical layout of the room, the person with the loudest voice dominating. But there is something uniquely different about half the room online and half the room in person, and it's the meetings and the classes I hate teaching. Give me all online or all in person, but the hybrid of both is
Yeah,
I think it's really
it's tricky,
challenging.
isn't it? Yeah.
One of the companies I worked with that they did it well was that they made basically a hybrid agreement. So if you were to join in a hybrid way, the person online would have to have cameras on because they did know that those with cameras on were more likely their body language would indicate interest, whereas when the camera's off, it became a bit
Mm,
problematic. And then the other thing was how well the room is set up for hybrid. So if it's just
mm,
one little laptop, that's very different to a big screen where you can see everyone and everyone can see you. So I think there's some, and then we'll have our preferences. Some people will prefer to always be online, others will prefer to be in person. But
mm.
I think we've kind of rose tinted the history a little bit because those meetings weren't that good either in my in my
Yeah.
experience. Like I had a
No,
job,
no, I think no, yeah,
so they
I
weren't.
think that's yeah, I think that's a good call out because I think I had similar view and I actually ended up co-authoring an article that went into a sort of publication which is about that very thing. I think all that happened was it basically shone a light on it.
Hmm.
And it just basically kind of amplified the challenges of doing that. One of the things I certainly saw happening more and more was teams were starting to think more about the working agreements they were making with one another, which and I can see Erin nodding. So the was the fact that at times that had kind of gone to the wayside and teams had just stopped thinking about the importance of these things. But because of the environment we found ourselves, as a consequence of the global pandemic, we had to revisit a lot of that. The other thing
Mm.
I was thinking about there that you touched on, which reminded me, you've got a really good bit in the book where it's quite a short bit, but it kind of really spoke to me. It's a bit where you're talking about this whole idea of difficult people.
Oh yeah.
And I was laughing because most of
Nobody
us,
loves part of the book
yeah,
just so you know.
right. Yeah, we all have this idea of you're dealing with somebody and you view them to be difficult for some reason. That could be a work environment. We've all had experiences that. I had that several years ago in one organization where a peer of mine, we just couldn't work together, right? There was various reasons for that. But of course, we both viewed the other likely to be difficult. But really what you were saying, and I thought it was spot on, was it's not the difficult person, it's a difficult situation. And the
Mm.
fact is, the whole thing is effectively co-created, right? It's a bit of like it takes two to tango. It's that kind of concept, right? And I really
Mm.
liked that. I thought that was really, really good. And I think it's part of this whole thing because if somebody's maybe challenging a certain behavior or calling something out, or maybe on behalf of somebody else and say, well, actually, that happened and I was offended that such and such took place, other people might go, oh, well, they're being difficult.
Mm.
So I thought it was a really good thing to be calling out. But yeah, it was quite a short treatment of it, but I thought it was quite powerful.
So it's the reason I only did a little bit, but it had to be in there, is that traditionally when marginalized people speak up for inappropriate marginalization, so they name the marginalization or the oppression, they're often labeled as the difficult person.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so that's actually why I introduced it, because I found, but then it went on when I started talking about it, and people were like, no, 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 Sheila is really difficult. And I'm like, no, 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 you find Sheila difficult, which is very
Yes.
different because if Sheila's difficult, I have to get rid of Sheila for a solution. But if I reframe it as I find Sheila difficult, well, now I can think about the space between us and what choices I have, which is there something in me being triggered? Do I give her too much power? Do I worry about what she thinks? Do I just not like the look of like there's loads of things I can think of, or I get really uncomfortable. She keeps calling racism at least then we can talk about the interaction that I'm responding
Yes.
to. But the original reason was because I found that it was one of the sticks used against marginalized people. Then the second
Mm,
reason was every group I went into, when I started to hear about a difficult person, even outside of this idea of marginalization, I was like, it's the same thing. It's the same issue, which is we've placed the problem in the person, which means that that person, the only solution is getting rid of that person or always
mm,
blaming them. But if we place the problem between us, I can do something with it, even if they really are someone I find very difficult. Like I might really dislike them and I might have all judgments about them, but I can't fix it unless I believe that there's something happening between us. And so I originally put it in for a small, like for a very specific reason. And then later I realized actually it was equally applicable across non like marginalization or oppression
mhm.
examples.
Because it's
But it's
quite late on, but it did.
yeah,
As soon as I read
nobody
it, I was
likes
like,
it.
yeah,
Yeah, at the
I was
point when I
thinking
tell
that.
them it's not a preference, but it is really
Yeah.
helpful because I've worked with people who were really looking at they couldn't fire, they couldn't fire the person, but actually was nearly like every day they went in kind of preparing for war, and it was really their approach that was problematic. The person was just
Yeah,
being the
exactly.
person.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
it's kind of
Yeah.
interesting.
But like you said, that you talked about judgment there, and that was the thing, and I think you mentioned it in that section because soon as you refer to someone as difficult, you've judged them, you've been judgmental and you've labeled them as difficult, where it's really the interaction. Yeah, so I thought that was quite a powerful bit. Short in its treatment, but I was pleased to see it. It was quite late on. I thought,
Like,
yes.
will I tell
Yeah.
you a little secret that I do when I really find it hard to put to think, oh, I'm finding them difficult because I really want them to be the problem? Because,
Mm.
that's a very natural thing. I kind of go to my head, somebody loves them. I just remind myself that somebody else loves them. And
Yes,
so they can't be all the bad things I'm projecting because I'm annoyed or upset or frustrated. And I
exactly.
literally go, somebody loves them. You're finding them difficult. And it sounds really silly, but it's one of the only ways
No,
I can get
I
myself
think it's
out
really
of
good.
or terrible when it's really activated in me. And their dog, their cat, their goldfish. I usually go, man, but yeah, you know, somebody
Yeah,
loves them.
no,
And
that's
I
great.
remind myself of that. Yeah.
I'm trying to think what else I was thinking because there was lots. That's the point, right? And there was a bit later. And I think there was a kind of recurring theme, but you touched on it in your intro. You were talking a lot about not pushing. So there was a bit where it was like not pushing beliefs, but actually trying to create an environment that's basically set up based on a set of values. And again, I thought that was kind of powerful because, we've often done talks here in, the agile space. Many of our community are agile coaches, practitioners, that sort of thing. And again, I think sometimes along the way, we've lost the idea about the fact that the fundamental of it all was the values, and the values still hold true. And
Mm.
the teams that really succeed, whether it's using these types of practices or anything, I don't think it's a universal thing, is based on values. So in my own work, and I do a lot of community development work in kind of engineering environments, I love to come from a position of thinking about, well, what are the values? And we've talked a lot over the last few years about purpose-led organizations and being driven by purpose, and all of these things were kind of coming up for me, and I just saw lots of linkages between other bodies of work, other things that many of us do, even other flavors of kind of leadership, right? You talked about social leadership. I'm a huge advocate of, social leadership practices. We've had Julian Stodd here speaking before. I've applied these things. There's lots of commonality, but these things don't sit in isolation. Is the thing
No.
for me. There's
No.
so much interconnection.
Yeah, and I think just to say on the values point, one of the things I was finding really difficult was I have very strong sense of what I think is right and wrong and a very strong
Mm,
personal moral code. But one of the issues I was finding in this practice when inclusion came in, people would excuse behavior for the purpose of what they wanted the outcome to be. So they weren't
mm,
actually living what I would consider inclusive principles or practices, but were kind of pushing what they considered an inclusive point of view. And I find that really challenging because as a coach, my job is not to, tell like change somebody's beliefs per se or tell them what they should or
yes.
shouldn't do. My job is to help them find a way forward in their own lives. But what can get in the way sometimes is a little bit of this unconscious righteousness of you have to, you're bad for not agreeing with me or my beliefs are more worthy than yours. I I kind of have this belief and like lots of practitioners, inclusion practitioners are not a fan of me for this reason, but I honestly believe that I fight for the purpose of inclusion because I believe everyone has the right to believe what they want, including the things I disagree with and would like them to believe differently. I think
Mm,
the principle, the fundamental principle that they can believe something differently to me is inclusive. But that's not always what I like. Like I don't
yeah.
like the belief, right? I don't
Yes.
encourage the belief. I don't enable the belief. But there is something about the principle versus the outcome. And sometimes we can get really focused on what's the right thing according to us without
Mm,
considering that actually our way forward, our actual practice might not be inclusive at all in what we're doing. We might just be pushing a belief we believe is inclusive. Um, to be your own police officer, it's a very strong word, police officer. But
yeah.
yeah, for me, just to Timmy's point, for me, it's actually about because I used to be critical of myself around it, and you'd cringe when you realize you said something or did something, or I'd be like,
Mm,
oh, I don't. I actually have so much compassion. I think that's really sad, Sheila, that you have that inherent, white supremacy in how you approached work. That's really sad that that's what you've inherited and you're perpetrating. What are you going to do differently? Like, and I have to talk to myself like that because otherwise I think you're a terrible person. and I go into this spiral that produces guilt and no
Mm.
change in behavior. So I actually, it's not from a critical lens, it's from a compassionate lens with the intention to change the impact. Or I might go, oh, there's some internalized homophobia. That's really sad that you have that. What are we going to do about it? Instead of, like, I talk to myself like a child, I'm not even joking. Instead of going, that's so awful, you're a terrible member of the queer community, right? Which is what I used to do. And then I'd feel shame and then I didn't want to tell anyone. And then I'd be in a room pretending I wasn't internally homophobic about something. And it spirals this kind of
Well,
fake and 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 so I think for me, it's about holding ourselves to an account, but in a compassionate. So one of my values for my business and for me is compassionate accountability. So
mm.
it's not about avoiding accountability, but it's not about using it as a whip because that
Beating
means
yourself
that
up. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
you wear yourself out, like, and you then don't
Exactly.
make the changes. You just pretend it never happened and feel shame.
Mm.
So I think we have to kind of have an accountability, but know that we'll never be done. So, like, in 2 years,
Yes.
I should cringe when I watch this one, having learned something new and go, oh my God, there it is, all that stuff I didn't know then. But that doesn't mean it's not worth doing it now. It just means that it's evolutionary, I think, this kind of approach. At least that's how I kind of try to frame it. Because in the beginning, I
No,
used to
I
just
get it. I
bad
get
about
it.
myself the whole time. And
No,
like,
I think it's an important point. And I think it's good you've called it out, and I'm sure that many of our group here would agree because suddenly we saw that shift in language as well, going, we should be kinder to ourselves because I was similar. I was quite a harsh critic of myself. I'd beat myself up for things, and it's took me quite a lot of effort to stop doing that. But as you were saying there, move more to a space where I'm going, well, actually, it's more about how I can learn to change my behavior or
mm,
change my view. It's same as when we now say, sometimes if something's gone wrong between individuals and maybe one of the parties apologizes, and you might take the view going, actually, it's not the apology really that we're looking for. It's to see a notable, demonstrable shift in behaviors, right? Because, I think Erin's called something out there about an upcoming family reunion, and we've all got families. I've got large families on many sides, but my wife's one of 10 and all this stuff. And you see all sorts. And I think when you try to apply some of these ideas into that type of context, I think it's really, really difficult, because I've got a situation like that at the moment and I'd like to be, applying some of this stuff. And I'm just trying to think about how best to do it,
mm,
but do
mm,
it in a way. So you talked earlier about repair. And in
mm,
certain aspects of our lives, I've certainly got that. There are relationships I think could certainly benefit from a conscious and active effort to try to repair.
mhm,
Because
mhm,
then, people take their positions, they don't see the other perspective or view. Like you said, there's a lack of compassion, and then it feels irreparable. And I'm not somebody who
mhm,
likes to see that personally.
mhm. Yeah.
Um,
I think just on the relationship piece, because so I will work with people who hold highly discriminatory views,
mm,
even discriminatory against me, right? And they might not always identify that I'm a member of the community that they're discriminating
mm,
against. And I've had colleagues say to me, why do you work with those people? And I say, because somebody needs to. And I I know, and I mean this now, it's not even in a, if somebody has a deep sense of hate or discrimination or rejection of someone's belief system, someone's identity, whatever it is, that means that they really don't believe they would be worthy if they had that identity, which means that they have a very limited ability to love themselves and a very strict set of rules. And so when I work with people who even hate on my identities, whether they're aware of it or not in any given moment,
mm.
I remember that that's the limitation that they have.
Yes.
And that doesn't mean I enable it because, like, sometimes, like, if they pay me to work with them on inclusion, I have to address it. If they're paying me to be a coach, it might be something that emerges in our work. But one of the things I found is that by holding that position, I feel completely different about them. And I see that they're working from a limited space. And I don't overcompensate, but it means that I also don't take it personally. Like, that's not about me. I'm an okay, valid human being. And this is actually about your inability to be with yourself. And that's really sad. I'm genuinely sad that you have to project that out onto a community. Now, obviously, if
Mm.
harm is done, there's still accountability required. I'm not excusing
Yeah.
that. But I think sometimes what can happen is we actually take it in. Like we think it's about us. I'm like, Okay,
No,
how do
it's
I?
a reflection. It's a reflection on
Yeah,
the other. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
it makes it much easier.
Yeah. No, I was
Oh,
slightly
bless
just
your
while we were
heart.
chatting.
I like
I was amused because I've heard Erin say that before. You mentioned that before. It's lovely.
that. Um,
Uh, no, it's good. So did you? So I'm conscious we've talked quite a lot about the book because I think it's excellent and it covers a lot of stuff. And as I say, I'll find myself dipping in and out of it again and again and continuing to use aspects of it, try to build them into my own work. Because again, I'm trying to, create inclusive communities and various things there, and there's lots of good stuff in there. Is there anything else you wanted to tease out, talk about? Then I think maybe in another 5 minutes or so, I'm quite keen to open up to the wider group and see what other people are thinking about what we've discussed, what else is coming up for folks. So, did you have any questions for me?
To be honest, Seth, I'd be interested in what people are thinking and feeling because there's lots of really great comments in the chat, and
Yes.
I think they kind of provoke, some really like there's a comment there about meditation, and I think like what if everyone else is enlightened? I used to use that one, um, and they're here to help me, even though they're
Mm,
interesting, but maybe we open up to the group and see if there's kind of
absolutely.
things that they'd like us to talk about or pose themselves because there's lots of really good,
It's good stuff
interesting
here. Yeah.
like Joe's point about the watch the value and ethical perspectives in the US. So I actually have a very specific opinion on this. I was working with some government agency in the US that has had to roll back, and it's really devastating um, on diversity and inclusion. And one of the things that I have found really interesting is because of the change in how the executive orders have gone out, actually legally they should be changing the names on what they do. Absolutely. I don't like that, but there's a really
Mm,
good reason to. What I would want to see is that they are committed to psychological safety and performance. And if they were committed to psychological safety and performance, they don't need a DEI policy because those things are required. And so I think that one of the issues I have with the moral and ethical approach is that it sometimes is like, oh, we pick it up, we put it down, depending on who's in charge and where the power is. Um, and I do have issues with them rolling back and stuff. But there's also a kind of legal reality, which is they've to work within a context now.
mm,
And I would like us not needing to talk about DI anymore. I'd like us to get to the point where we're actually creating changes that you can't just do an executive order and create disadvantage straight away. Just like white supremacy, you can't go out and say no more white supremacy in organizations. It's so baked in, we wouldn't know where to unbake it. Well, I want to bake in equity and
mm,
anti-oppressive practice so that you don't have to call it that. You can't like we don't go around going, oh, professionalism is white supremacy every time it's written in a document, but that's what it is. That's usually what it's linked back to. I'd like us
mm.
to do that with D&I. What are the things that we don't actually need to say DEI? But
Yeah.
everything we do role models it. And for me, that's going to be how we stop political or PR agendas getting into our workplaces. So I think Joe's point is like I'm watching it all the time. I was part of an organization. I'm part of organizations that have bases in the US. They're throwing out statements about D&I in Ireland or in the UK or in Europe. And I'm like, it doesn't matter. We have discrimination law that they're going to have to write different policies. It's a legal requirement, actually. So for me, there's something about the power that we leave in the hands of people when we don't bake it in. And I think maybe if we think about baking it in, you can't give an executive order to get rid of white supremacy or ableism. It's baked in.
Yeah.
I'd like us to bake in some of this stuff. That's my one thing I'd say. Um, and that's what I'm talking a lot of organizations that have American bases. We're talking about how you make sure that DEI is baked in without calling it DEI because
So
they've got
no, that's great, and I absolutely support that. And from the chat, I can tell others are of similar view. So you kind of half answered the question I was going to ask you. And we were joking at the start before we kicked off the session. So you were last here. Wait for it.
month.
In July 2021. So
Oh,
nearly, yeah, I didn't realize it was that. So nearly
wow.
4 years ago, right? But when you were here, you did a session which was actually called Diversity in Practice. And that's why,
Mm,
A, I was intrigued when you mentioned diversity at the outset in your introduction, but also when I was thinking about it earlier before we got started, I was thinking, actually, what's and you've talked about it throughout, but things have changed so much, and we've seen what's going on, the shifts that we've seen in the landscape. What do you feel for you in the work that you do, because you're actively working in this space, is an ongoing but really major concern for you? But you've kind of touched on some of it there. But can you elaborate a little bit more? Because it's
Yeah,
four
look,
years on since you were last here.
yeah. Yeah, and to be fair, when I was last here, I was grappling with some of the common conversations being had around DEI, whereas now I'm not grappling with them. I understand that some
Okay.
well-intentioned are not evidenced or practical or effective. So I
Mm,
push back on unconscious bias training now, which I wouldn't have done previously. And I do first and foremost from an ethical perspective. We don't go to work to have our minds changed or our beliefs changed. And so for me, to change someone's mind where they don't opt into it, even if it's an unconscious belief, is problematic. Whereas in the beginning, I didn't really see the ethical issue, but now I do. I compare it to conversion therapy because unconscious bias training, first of all, the evidence doesn't say that it works. It says it works for some groups, it doesn't work for others. And for other groups, for another kind of third, it actually makes them more biased, just conscious of it, even more sure that their ideas are true. So that's one thing that I've pushed back on. I think the challenge we're going to have moving forward, and one of the reasons I focus on a needs-based approach to inclusion, is that we're going to keep confusing the role of inclusion in workplaces with political liberal and conservative struggles. And a lot of the people who teach this work lean in a particular way, which means
mm,
they've already, before they even start, there's an excluding occurring. Because for people with an opposite political view to agree with them, it starts to be problematic for someone's cognitive dissonance. So I think we have to unravel inclusion in workplaces from political ideologies and actually speak about it from the perspective of human rights in the workplace and also from the perspective of the role of work. So what are we doing at work? What's the point of going to work? That type of conversation and focus on what's needed instead of identity. So a lot of the time people are using, and I say this now, those of us with more visible privilege are using um, these conversations to understand themselves, and that's fine. But one of the issues is that we're not always assessing what the needs of people are. We're just putting them into groups. So somebody says, "Oh, the disabled community." First of all, there isn't a disabled community. There's many communities that use the word disabled, but also their needs are different. Or so I say marginalized by race now. I don't use like BAME, or I have issues with some of
mm,
those terms. But basically, this idea that just because you share some part of your identity with other people means you have the same needs.
mm,
And, it could, including religious, doesn't mean you have the same needs. So I
mm,
think what we have to do is be careful of the allure to lean into maybe some political, and I mean like social political perspectives in terms of liberalism and conservatism, left, right, that type of thinking. And we actually have to say, well, actually, the purpose of inclusion in the workplace is to help people perform. It's to help
mm.
them go to work and do a great job and feel good
Yeah.
about themselves. And so when we think about inclusion, we have to think about what people need to do that.
Mm,
Whereas I am really worried if we keep going where we're going, we're going to end up in all these conflicts of beliefs and ideas rather than the purpose of going to work, which is adding value to the purpose of the role.
to
And
the
then everyone has
organization.
the
Yeah.
right to get what they need to do that. So
Yeah.
so that's kind of what I think is probably the biggest shift since the last time.
No, it's
And
great.
maybe
It's really good.
what I'm feeling strong about. Yeah.
No, no, that came through, and I think you're absolutely right. I think yes, I think we have had times and occasions, and I've seen it myself, where it was there was a focus on it, inclusivity and all this stuff, and of course these things are hugely important, and they can really help an organization's performance and all this good stuff. And you talk about that in the book, and that's absolutely spot on. And there has been times where organizations have had to really focus on attracting the best talent because they're in a competitive space, but also retention. And the retention issue came from different perspectives, but also as other generations, come into the workplace, they do value different things. And the landscape's moved on. So it's very so when my kids, especially my youngest, because he's nearly finishing school and he's then going to go into higher education, but when he then enters a workplace, it's going to be quite different again. And his views are different because their generation are different, what they've been exposed to different, how they're brought up is different, what they value is different. So I think all of that is part of this complex kind of landscape. The other thing I was intrigued about, because I don't really think you talk a lot about it in the book, is so if we think about leadership, and I'm not a huge fan of the term psychological safety because I think it got to a point where it was kind of, overused and misused, and its sort of importance was diluted because, I was finding myself in situations where people would say things like, "Oh, this is a safe space." And you think,
Oh,
soon as somebody says that, right? Well, it's not because you've basically drawn attention to that and you've done it in a way which makes it's like somebody turn it's like me saying to you, "Go, hey Sheila, you can trust me." As soon as I say that, how likely are you to then trust me because I've called that out, right? But it should be explicit in my behaviours. What's your take on that? And again, I struggle a little bit with the linkage to leadership because we're obviously, like you said, talking about not just inclusion, but leadership and how that those practices can be more inclusive. Because I
mhm.
think that's quite a bit of a struggle, and leadership often for folk doesn't have those types of connotations traditionally, especially when you
Yeah.
link back to positional authority. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I have a load of like, okay, so psychological
Sorry, that was
safety.
quite quite a
No,
lot.
it's really good though. Psychological safety is co-created.
Mm,
Even if I'm the one in power, I can't give it to you. It's a bit like inclusion. I can't go, come, let me be, come, you're included, right?
yeah,
Like it's
exactly.
co-creation. I might say, come, I'd like to include you. But the part that makes it psychologically safe or inclusive is what do we
Language.
need for this space to work for us to be,
Yeah.
and this is really important, safe enough. So it's not
Mm,
safe because sometimes people have false ideas of safety being I'll never be challenged or I'll always be comfortable. I'll talk about comfort in a sec. What do we need to do for this to be safe enough for you to perform? That is psychological safety. But I can't give it to you. We co-create it because if I don't tell you what it is, then you can't give it to me. And the example I use is a racial example where I was working with somebody and um as a white woman, I said to the person who was a brown woman, what would you need for this to be safe if we end up having to talk about white supremacy and race? And she was like, no, nobody's asked me, but no white person's ever asked me that. And I said, I assume you've had bad experiences previously with white people because statistically the odds are high. So how do I make sure I'm not that person in this experience without? And she said, well, the fact you said it, I'll just tell you. And I was like, oh, I'll just listen. And then we worked together. And then when I did overstep, because I didn't know some of the stuff, she was like, just so you know, you've done. And I'm like, oh, I'm really sorry about that. I'll go look it up. So what I
uh,
didn't do was ask her to tell me everything about it. I went, okay, thank you for notifying me. I'm sorry. Let me go and investigate that. I'll come back to you. But psychological safety is co-created. She could have never told
mm,
me that she'd had these negative experiences and never told me when I got it wrong. And I could have pretended that there was no difference in race. I didn't see color and, you know, I intend to be a good person. So that's the only possible thing that could possibly happen here. So there's something about the co-creation of that. The second thing is one of the pushbacks I've been getting over the last couple of years, like from when I hear about training, or even people on my team training people, is I didn't feel safe. And I said, no, no, no. Did you feel uncomfortable or did you feel unsafe? Because uncomfortable is I didn't like what was shone on the light that was shone there,
mm,
which is a learning environment. There should always be discomfort. Or did you feel unsafe, which was now that that light has been shone on me, I'm going to have a negative consequence, such as losing my job, being criticized, being talked about. They're different things. So psychological safety, which unfortunately I think has been kind of co-opted by those who actually need it less, and that's why it's being overused and kind of talked about in a certain way,
mm.
has this idea that it means I shouldn't be uncomfortable. And that is just not true. Good psychological safety means it's very uncomfortable, but
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
safe to
yeah.
be uncomfortable. And I
Nice.
think that's the piece that
Yeah,
is missing. And then maybe just
great.
the other thing the minute someone says something is psychologically safe, and I teach this when I work with the British Psychological Society, I teach their inclusive leadership course. And when I work with them, and these are often half of them are psychologists, I say very clearly, if you tell someone it's a safe space, you've already harmed them because you haven't asked them what they need to be safe. Like it's an
I
obvious,
called the same thing out. Yeah, absolutely.
like, what are we doing? But unfortunately we're taught to do it that way because it's like, oh, if I state it, it must be. But that's like me saying there's no racism, there's no homophobia. Just because I said it doesn't make it true.
Doesn't make it so. Yeah.
No, so there's co-creation, I think, is at the center. And whether you are and Jervis Bush, he's a professor in Canada on dialogic OD. He wrote a paper which did challenge these concepts of psychological safety, which is this idea that somehow leaders give it to people. And he said that's not how social exchange works. You interact with people. So to me, as somebody said in the beginning, what's an inclusive practice? First of all, in any setting, what is inclusive can be exclusive. So it might not be inclusive. So there's not a practice that is in and of itself, it's how you do it. But one thing that is more likely to lead to inclusive practice is co-creating, doing things with people, not to them, not at them, but
Yeah.
doing it with them. And that's, if there's co-creation, you're more likely to be closer to inclusion than if you go from a more kind of directive approach. And that doesn't mean you can't direct things in work. You might need to complete things like, "Oh, we've got to produce this outcome in this time," right? That's directive. But I can also say, how will we go about this? How do we make this
Yes.
work? That's
Yeah.
the beginning of inclusion. I don't have to talk about identity to create inclusion. But then other times, like that example with that colleague of mine, I did have to name, I have a feeling we might need to think about this
Mm,
because I can see it in the room. And if I'm seeing it, you're going to be way more sensitive to racial risks in this room.
mm.
And then we were able to do it. But I think co-creation is probably keeping us closer to inclusion than knowing everything does, because then that
Agreed.
just leads to stereotyping and misapplication of knowledge, I think.
And just thinking about what we've just been chatting about, it takes me right back to the one of my favorite quotes in the book, the George Bernard Shaw one. You know, there's got to be communication. There's got to be a dialogue, and if it's an open dialogue and a fair and balanced dialogue, and each party is hearing the other party, you've got greater chance of actually creating something that feels inclusive because everyone who's involved feels well will more likely will feel more likely heard than they might do if they're just spoken at, right? It's not then it's a it's not a conversation. I'm
Can I
conscious we got
add,
of course you
can I
can.
just add
Yeah, of
one
course
thing?
you can. Yeah,
Sorry,
of
just
course you can. Yeah.
the other thing that seems to really get people is that inclusion is an invitation, not a mandate. And
Mm,
so when I talk about co-creating inclusive environments, people have the right not to join you. And so I talk about, I was on a race equality roundtable, global table for a particular profession, and I was basically asked to leave because I pointed out we were all white women and something felt like we were out of balance. It's like a group of men making a decision for, I was like, something's not right here. And people had a really, really strong reaction. And the kind of pushback, the defensiveness that kind of, and I think these people have grown since, but in that moment was,
mm,
well, they didn't come, meaning every other race didn't come, right? And I was like, oh, maybe they didn't come because we're a group of white women sitting on this round table. And when the issue comes up that we're all white, we're defensive. Like maybe inclusion isn't just the invitation part, but they have the right to decline. And then we have the responsibility to reflect on why they declined. And when we took responsibility that it's not the other's fault, that actually maybe our invitation is flawed, or maybe there's risk with our invitation because there's been previous negative experiences,
mm,
then that changed. Now the table is far more diverse, gender, race, like loads of things. But it was really interesting that the initial idea was, well, we invited them, whoever, and this is just one example, we invited them, and therefore now we've been inclusive. But actually, part of inclusion is learning when your invitations don't land or work, that actually there might be something for you to learn in that rather than the other group or the people you invited don't
mm.
want to be there. It might be it's
Yeah.
too risky or they've had bad experiences. So I think thinking about it as invitations that you adapt until they're more effective is also a nice way to think about it, because there's good reasons people don't want to be involved in some efforts. And some of those things we haven't taken responsibility for yet. Like it would be easier if it was their fault then. Like I joke about this with social workers. I was working with social workers, and this social worker used to say about one of the clients, he never attends the meetings. Seems fairly reasonable. He's a kid. He's about
Mm.
16 at the time, doesn't attend the meetings. And I said, oh, how many meetings have you booked? 7, didn't attend. All right, where were they? In the office. Okay, not a great setting for this kid. Okay, grand. What time? 9 o'clock in the morning. I said, I'm
Yeah,
sorry, now
exactly.
I have 16-year-old nieces and nephews. They don't go to 9 a.m. appointments either, but that's
That's it.
not because they're hard to engage.
They're
It's
not
because
up.
16, right? So sometimes our invitation itself is limited, and we
Yeah, exactly.
we should interpret the response to it as data to help us improve it. So I
Agreed.
think it's a good one to think about. So
No,
sorry.
I like that. No, that's fantastic. I think that's a very good insight because again, when you're saying some of these things, sharing some of these insights and perspectives, I'm linking it back to a lot of work I do in community development, right? And one of the most important things is the invitation. Now, if the invitation, because the invitation should be fairly low barrier, right? But sometimes
Mm.
it's forgotten that the barrier to entry is a huge determinant factor on whether people accept that invitation, then basically take that step and basically effectively come through the door, right? And everything you've
Mm.
just described speaks to that. I'm conscious we've got about, well, 15 minutes. I need a few minutes at the end as always, just to wrap things up and close the session. And it's been fantastic. Shall we open it up to the audience? See what else is coming up for folk? Did we miss any questions? Anybody want to chip in here? Please do, because this is an open conversation. It's clearly a complex one with many dimensions, but feel free to raise your virtual hand, as it were, and share perspectives if you'd like to, or ask us to build on anything. Take advantage of the fact that Sheila's here, sharing our vast experience in this ever-changing landscape. Any questions we missed? Paula, do you see anything that maybe we missed? Anybody want to jump in?
No, I'm
Just
just
raise your hand
thinking
so I
about
can
what you
spot you.
said
Oh, there you
about
are.
safety is not given, it's made.
Mm.
It's with, not to or at, and it's an act of co-creation. How do you encourage groups to be accountable then for the environment that they've made?
So the first thing is I become accountable for my part in it.
Hmm?
So I find, I don't know if you've ever heard of um, disclosure therapy. It's like this approach of disclosing things to help. Usually it helps with shame, but it helps with other things. So usually I will start by saying, I notice I'm in this group and I'm part of this, and yet I'm really clear that this doesn't feel like we've really co-created, like I'll own something in it. The other thing is that usually if I have a formal position with the group, I will do a group agreement. And if they don't add it to the group agreement themselves, I will ask them, can I add? When we're out of balance, we come and check. We take responsibility rather than blame. And I literally add things like that because I use a lot of group dynamics in my work that when I work with teams and something goes wrong, I'm very good at saying, uh, this isn't one person's responsibility. We're a group and we've allowed this to happen. What can we do better? So I try to phrase them as we questions as well. But one is try to lower the shame or create an agreement up front that I can address it. And then the other one is addressing it as we's and not letting it be a kind of one person thing. Because when somebody goes, oh, well, it's actually Erin's the problem, or, or actually Erin,
Well, I
you've been,
generally am, but
yeah, I'll say, why did we all facilitate that? Like, and people are like, oh, I thought we could just point to Erin, right? Like, so I bring it back to what we as a group have normed in some way. And people tend to, once they get the hang of it, what I have found is it brings them great relief to be able to actually name the things in a way that doesn't create like large amounts of blame or shame, but actually some accountability. But group agreement, self-disclosure appropriately, and we questions, they're kind of the three things I tend to use in those settings. Yeah. It's
thank
good.
you.
Great stuff. That help, Erin? That answer the question? Yeah.
Mhm.
Awesome. Right, I'm just sifting through the chat, but I didn't see any other
Erin and her family
questions.
reunion.
I was
I
going to
did
say
put an agreement
you
on
be
that bugger. I'm like, you're gonna leave religion and politics at home. No,
we always say that, but yeah, I see you've been
no,
very
no,
active
no,
in the
no.
chat.
We will be leaving them at home.
Excellent. Well, I look forward to hearing post that reunion.
Everyone wants a report back on
I,
that
I was
thing.
going to say, yeah, but we'll see what comes at your retro.
Do you know, I've just spotted Katie's comment as well, talking about difficult people. There can be some resistance to change. Those people
Mhm.
can be difficult. So just from a kind of change process point of view, one of the things I do is I expect there to be resistance. It's actually part of the change, not in opposition to the change. And then the other thing about change is I use the data of the resistance. So some people say to push through. I don't. I do the opposite. I bring it in. I say, okay, this feels like, you're really resistant. Tell me about why. And I really try to understand because usually, first of all, if they dispel some of the energy, that can be helpful. But secondly, there might actually be some valid data you can use to have a more successful outcome. So unlike traditional planned change models, I don't force it. I use more emergent change models from like dialogic OD, dialogic organizational development models, because what they do is they allow me to use the resistance as new data and blend it in, and it tends to then get to the end with more buy-in than if I just pushed it with a traditional planned change model. So that's something to think about in terms of, do we think resistance shouldn't be there, which means already we have an issue with the resistance. I plan resistance into all change. It should be there because it's going to stop me going way too left or way too right. And it will stop me going off of my ideals and maybe stay closer to what is needed by people. So that might be a helpful one as well.
Great stuff. Any other question? I'm conscious you had a few other bits and pieces to share, so maybe we'll do that, Sheila, in 5 minutes. Oh, you've gone on mute or something. I think you're on mute. Yes. You've accidentally muted yourself, I
Oh,
think.
sorry, I thought you
Yes.
had put something on. Do you want me to share the slides? Oh, Sheila. Sheila, I think you were
Oh,
here the last.
Sheila. Yeah, Sheila's
Yeah.
one of our regulars. Always a great contributor. Hi, Sheila.
Hi, I'm trying to figure out how to formulate this. You talked about a conference where all the people at the table were, I think, white females,
Mhm.
and it was about inclusion. And later you had more diversity. But I think I have friends who are in economically disadvantaged groups where they wind up doing jobs that are several levels above what they're getting paid for. You also talked about not liking anything that is a hybrid event where some people are in person and some people are remote. I think you'd do better with getting the inclusion if you had a hybrid event, because in a lot of cases, the problem is they can't afford to attend if it requires travel. And I don't know if that's something you've taken into consideration in those situations or not. But I definitely have friends who would be at a title of project manager, but doing like VP work.
Yeah. Yeah. So they're three kind of separate things in terms of the group that I'm talking about was a race equity group. So it wasn't even inclusion. It was about race
Okay.
equity in a certain profession, but everybody that was present was white.
The
So
irony, it's a
yeah,
race inclusion and
no,
everyone's
that,
white.
yeah,
But
no,
they were
so that,
female. That's an improvement.
yes. So, well, we were all females, but statistically in this profession, females volunteer more than males. So it was kind of
Yes.
replicate some of the issues that we had. The second thing is I don't dislike hybrid events from a professional point of view, as in I think that they allow people not just from different economic backgrounds, but also disability, also geography to access. I just personally find them harder, and that's just a personal thing rather than they are best practice in my opinion, and it's better to have a design around them to be best practice in terms of how you make it work really well. I just find them really hard on a personal level. But I'm not at all suggesting we shouldn't do them. In fact, I would always argue for them. I just find them personally really difficult to attend, to facilitate especially.
Oh,
So
I
that's the two.
agree.
And then
They're
the
difficult to facilitate, especially when you have people like me who don't turn their camera on. But I have a migraine right now, so the picture would not be pretty.
yeah, it also probably wouldn't help your eyes to be watching yourself on the screen. But I suppose that's the difference, I guess, between personal preference and like I don't really believe in best practice. I believe in better practice, but people are familiar with best practice as a term. I think it's better practice hybrid, exactly what you're saying, for loads of reasons. And we know the research tells us that. I just have a personal preference, but I would always go with the better practice rather than the personal preference. Um, but there's some good points. And the social economic thing is really important because in most countries like in Ireland, the UK and Europe still, it's not factored into discrimination legislation. And yet we know your social economic background and experience is one of the biggest predictors in your ability to be in poverty or not, um, financial security or not, and some other things. So it's interesting that something that's so important is so under legislated for, I guess, I think as well, and considered actually in workplaces.
Mm. So it's just thinking about the hybrid thing there. That, at the end of the day, a number of us work in, multinational teams, so hybrid's the only option. But back to your opening, we should just be working well together to ensure it's an effective thing, right? And everybody can meaningfully contribute and be part of it, and that's what it comes down to. But that's still something we're trying to get good at. I've seen some pretty bad examples, but yeah, all good. Do you want to just close out because you had some other closing content and stuff, some shared with the group, which would be good to do,
I'll
and then I'll
just
wrap up because we've got 5 minutes left. So awesome.
I'll be very quick, Seth.
No,
Just
no
in
worries, no rush.
anyone's interested. So these are just weekly leadership letters that I send out. You can just take a picture if you did want to be on them. There's no expectation of pressure. Donald, when he was setting this up, told me to put a discount code. But you can also message me afterwards if you wanted. I can just send it to you anyway. It's not a big deal. And Seth will share it with you. And that was kind of it, Seth. So thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I really
Fantastic. No, it was great, and again, I know we talked about it. I shared my experiences with it, but it is a fantastic read. Lots of great insights, very thought provoking, and there's lots of things in there that you can dip in and out of and consider taking back into your workplaces, or as I touched on earlier, might even be applicable in your wider societal, interactions, because I think a lot of it is universally applicable. So great stuff. So just to thank Sheila again, fantastic to have you back. I really enjoyed it. Great insights, great shares, great conversation, and thanks also to everyone else for joining us and participating. It's been wonderful. We will get the recording out for anyone who couldn't join us this evening. And then just a quick thanks again to Paula for stepping in and helping me out this evening. Really appreciate it. As ever, can't do this on our own. And oddly, I'm not sure this has ever happened. Certainly not in the 5 years or so I've been involved in posts like this. I don't have anything lined up for you for May, which is an unusual situation to find myself in. Donald and I are working on a few things, so hopefully we'll have something published soon. So look out for these things on Meetup. But yeah, it's unusual for me not to have something to share for you. So I don't know, something different. Is there anything anybody else would like to call out or share with the group more widely that they're involved in that's coming up before I bring it to a close? I don't see any hands. If you want to, or you can drop it. You can drop it into the chat. I love that term. What was that? What did I miss? I would like to be. Okay. Yes. Yeah.
practice.
Yeah. I guess that's the deliberate practice of things, and I think that's what I was taking away from the book. There's things that I would like to take into some of the work that I'm doing. Also, we didn't end up talking about it, but the FAR model, because I'm a big fan of nonviolent communication. It's one of my favorite books of all time. And when I saw that bit and I was reading, I thought it's really good. But it just as I close, it's the acknowledgement piece that I think is really, really powerful and really important. So maybe a great note to end on there. Just the whole idea that we look and we listen and we at the very least try to acknowledge. So yeah, maybe a nice way to finish. But listen, thanks again, everyone. Great to have you here. Thanks for your participation, your contributions as ever, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. So enjoy the rest of your mornings, your afternoons, and your evening. And if you are celebrating Easter, then we wish you a happy Easter when it comes. So thanks again. Take care, everyone. Thank you. Thanks again, Sheila.